chapter 11, in the middle of the chapter. If you're looking in the book, it's on page 46. And at this point, we're exploring the range of Russias. Does that sound right? It sounds almost like a Western song, Russia on the range. So, and we said that really what defines a Russia is an individual who at some point, and the key word over here is some point, because really it's a question of which point and how long and how regularly and how badly. But the definition of a Russia is somebody who falls under the influence of their negative side. So, when they talk about being under the influence, this is a different version of being under the influence. And up until this point, we've spoken about the most, so to speak, the lightest type of Russia that exists. And we said that that's a person who has these breakthrough moments of failure. But generally speaking, they are aligned with what Hashem wants. And even when they do succumb to what it is that their negative side wants to do, it's kind of superficial. Doesn't get them too badly, too deeply. So we said, for example, it might be they think something they shouldn't. It might be they say something they shouldn't. It might be they do something that they shouldn't. But it's not going to be this complete, so to speak, surrender, that the bad guys took over. The rogues are running the establishment. That's not what's happened. Now, where we left off last week was by saying you've got to be careful about thoughts. Because it's very easy for a person to say, I didn't do anything. And actually, if our whole Judaism is all about getting caught, as some people will say, the 11th commandment is, not to get caught. So if our whole Judaism is about doing the right thing so I will be rewarded and avoiding the bad stuff so that I don't get punished, then if I haven't done anything, surely that's okay. Surely nobody's going to hunt me down or punish me for something that I thought, even something that I said. So what we learned last week, which was quite insightful, is where we left it off last week, is Hirhure Avera Koshim Me Avera. What goes on inside the brain is much harsher than what goes on in a person's behavior, because your brain affects you. So the stuff that's in the mind really affects us in a very profound and very deep way, as opposed to the stuff that is behavior. It might just be exactly that. It might just be behavior. Let's unpack that a little bit, because it's relevant to what we're going to be speaking about this evening, because we did stop in the middle of that concept last week, and I left the shock value for this week, which is that it is possible to do something wrong without actually doing something wrong in your head. So let's understand that for a moment. Let's say that a person drives over the speed limit. Is that wrong? I mean, it may not feel wrong. And if you live in certain parts of the world, it's just the way everybody behaves. But it is against the law, so it is wrong. So now, if a person drives over the speed limit, are they a criminal? What I mean to say is, yes, they could be prosecuted for a crime. But are they a criminal? In other words, the question is, how bad is this person? Because sometimes you could behave in a particular way that is against the law. Doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you don't feel that this law applied to you in these circumstances. Right? So when the policeman pulls you over, you're like, well, officer, and then we go about justifying why it was actually appropriate for us to speed at that particular time. And because we're not people, we're not bad people, we don't have malicious intention, we're not looking dafka to break the law, just so happens. So behavior, although behaviors have impacts, behaviors are not always an indicator of where a person's at and kind of how bad they are. Does that make sense? Even words. Sometimes a word pops out that we should not have said, and it was very upsetting to somebody else, maybe even harmful to somebody else. Doesn't necessarily make us a bad person. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. How often do we do that? I shouldn't have said that. I was being insensitive. That means straight away the person's making a correction, which effectively says, I'm not a bad person, even though I said something that was bad, that was harmful, that was offensive, that was upsetting, that was insensitive. So behavior and words can be bad without making the person who did or said those things bad. It's a funny thought. So if I'm looking from the perspective of the cop, well, the cop says you broke the law, so I'm going to give you a ticket. And the cop is right. The person who breaks the law deserves a ticket. But it would be ridiculous if that person now had a criminal record for having broken that law without malicious intent, because what happened? Okay, so I was a few kilometers over the speed limit.
Surely the question is, if you're going to say, oops, sorry, I was being insensitive, well then you need to, like with all mistakes, we learn from our mistakes. If you're not going to learn from the mistake and then just continue to do it this again and again and again, well then yes, you are.
Good. So you're raising a different point, an important point, very important point. So you're raising the point that if a person pays lip service to their apology, but they don't actually do something to improve their behavior, then they really are not a good person. Because if somebody was a good person, they wouldn't just use the excuse me, I shouldn't have done that excuse to get out of trouble. Fair point, and I take the point, and it's something we're going to touch on a little bit later. Maybe this evening, maybe not this evening, and that's this wonderful topic of Jewish guilt, which, of course, everybody is dying to hear because we just don't have enough of it, and we need to know more about it. So, before we get to that topic, let's go back over here for a moment and speak about thought. So, thoughts operate in two ways. There are the thoughts that pop into our heads, and then there are the thoughts that we think. What's the difference? I know it might sound like semantics. What's the difference between thoughts that pop into our heads and thoughts that we think?
Conscious versus subconscious.
Correct.
Pop into your head is chokhmah.
Okay, thoughts that pop into your head do not have to be chokhmah. Ideas that pop into your head, an idea is chokhmah. Not all of our thoughts are ideas. Meaning to say, not all of our thoughts are meaningful or the beginning of a process that is an intellectual process. So if it's the beginning of an intellectual process, then we would call it chokhmah. But conscious versus subconscious is probably a good way to define it. So for example, this. Let's say that somebody cuts you off on the road. Now, I don't know how it is for the international audience. I can only describe how it is over here in the South African context. So somebody cuts you off in the road. The thought that may cross your mind is, I'm going to go and cut that guy off. And then I'm going to drive slowly. And I'm going to show him who owns the road because he thinks he owns the road. Right? That's how people, he thinks he owns the road. I actually own the road. So that thought that a person has, that would be closer to what you're calling like a subconscious thought. It's a thought that pops into your head. It's not that a person sat down, thought about this, came up with a premeditated response to people to cut me off on the road. It just popped into my head. That's what happened. I was on the road, somebody drove badly, and the thought that pops into my head is revenge, or I'm going to show him, or whatever. That does not make you an aggressive person just because you had that thought cross your mind. It's if you think about that thought, then it's a problem. You start literally getting into the whole road rage cycle. It's when that becomes a process of thinking rather than just a thought. That's when we've got a problem. And we know this. We know this in the physiology of the human brain, that when you rethink the same thoughts or similar thoughts again and again, it creates synapse connections, it creates neural pathways, and then that becomes how we think. And we know this right across the board. It's in all areas of positive thinking and negative thinking and self-defeatist thinking and aggressive thinking and so on and so forth. We just reinforce the way that we think by creating the neural pathways that we create. So let's say you walk in to a person's house and they have left a whole lot of cash on their kitchen table. Okay, now hopefully this doesn't happen to you, but the thought pops into your head to say, I'm going to take the cash. Now, hopefully you never had that thought, right? But if that thought pops into your head and it might scare you, oh my gosh, what on earth am I thinking that I want to take that person's cash? But even if that thought does pop into your head, doesn't make you a criminal. Number one, you don't take the money, so you're not a criminal, you can't be prosecuted. But number two, it doesn't even make you a criminal mind because it was just a thought that popped into your head. And then you're like, oh, that's ridiculous. Obviously, I'm not going to take somebody else's money. I'm not that guy. And you move off and you're fine. When does it become a problem? When you allow the thought to proceed. I wonder if there is a way. Maybe if I took part of the money and then they didn't realize that the money was missing, because they'll walk in, they'll still see the cash, and it's only later, maybe they won't count it, maybe they'll never know. And judging by how big that wad of cash is, they probably won't even miss. Once you start going down that wormhole, well, then you've got a problem. Because even though you might still not take the money, the mind is going into a dark place. And once the mind starts to go into a dark place, it's going to, at some point, have an impact elsewhere. Because we are what we think. That defines us, that creates our reality, that impacts subsequently, it's going to impact our behaviors. So that's why we say that thoughts which are associated with negative behavior are in a certain regard worse than the negative behavior, because it is possible for a person to do something which is wrong and then it's water off a duck's back, and it is possible for somebody not to do something wrong, but it has completely invaded their heads. Which brings us to the next part, that is the uncomfortable reality, or the uncomfortable piece that he's going to share with us now. Okay, so if you are in the book on page 46, so we're on the fourth line, halfway through the line, and on the screen you'll see it's the top line. So we said Oy b'machshava levad. We were talking about the various possible manifestations. We were talking about the Rasha light, the person who is not aligned with what Hashem wants, but they're not really a bad person because they only have these, irregular aberrations where they step out of line and they don't do what they're supposed to. And then it only affects, we said, either just their behavior or just their thoughts, or just their speech, or just their thoughts. Here, hurei avera hakoshim me avera, where they think thoughts associated with transgressions, which are actually sometimes harsher than the transgressions themselves. And by the way, there's another reason for that. Again, an uncomfortable reason, and that is because it's much more likely that a person will entertain a really bad behavior in their fantasy than they would actually do it. So in that respect also, you could say the thoughts of transgressions are worse in a sense than the transgressions, because we'll allow our thoughts to go places we would never go. So the kid who grew up his whole life only eating kosher can fantasize about the cheeseburger, even though he'll never eat the cheeseburger. That means that his brain could be involved in a world that his behavior would never take him to. And that's why the thoughts could actually be worse than the behavior in that sense. Again, not in the sense of actual transgression, not in the sense of prosecution, but certainly in the sense of where I live. Because at the end of the day, where my head is, that is where I live. Interesting question. Don't we all have an inner dialogue? I don't know, I'm going to check with myself and come back to you. So, don't we all have an inner dialogue? Well, yes, we do. Absolutely. Constantly. We all have an inner dialogue all the time. And that inner dialogue is dilemmas, right? We all have dilemmas. And equally, there's certain areas where we don't have an inner dialogue, where the thought comes into our heads and we automatically dismiss it and there's no space for dialogue. So there'll always be an inner dialogue happening. The question is only on what topics. And we're not here saying, by the way, we're not saying that's automatically a bad thing. We're talking about the individual who goes down the rabbit hole, who allows themselves to have this whole fantasy or this whole thought process. And that's exactly what brings us to the next point. V'gam. When we talk about how a person's thought process and therefore their brain could be in an unhealthy space, and therefore they would fall into the category of the Rasha, admittedly the lighter end of the Rasha scale, doesn't only have to be that the person is fantasizing about actually committing the crime. Rather, let's just remind ourselves for one moment that Tanya was written before the advent of TV and certainly before the advent of the internet. So, what's the worst scenario he could use of how a person pollutes their mind? A person who fantasizes about not criminal interactions, but just normal intimacy of a couple. So somebody fantasizes basically about other people. Now, in those days, that's all a person could do was fantasize. Today there's a whole industry that allows people to visualize what they used to be able to fantasize. So there, she'oiver al azoras haTorah v'nishmarta mikol davar ra shelo yeharer b'yoyim chulei. So what's wrong with that? What's wrong with the person having an innocent fantasy about, not doing a sin, but just, I wonder how that person is, or whatever their particular fantasy might be. So what's wrong with it? He quotes the Gemara, where the Gemara tells us that what we think about during the day will eventually have an impact on us, and very often at night. So the things that people dream about tend to relate to the things that are on their minds. And that's why you can tell that this is the time of the year where the very most common dream in the Jewish community is Jewish women dreaming that it's Pesach and they haven't started cooking yet. Because that's what's on their minds. And I'm sure if we did a poll, that would emerge as the most prevalent dream at this time of the year. So, what's on your mind? That's what you'll end up dreaming. Your anxieties, your thoughts, your aspirations. If you're grappling with something at work, whatever it is, that's what's going to come up in your dreams. So therefore, the Gemara says that a Jewish person is required to keep their thoughts clean so that their dreams are clean. Because it's going to have if a person has an inappropriate dream, it's going to have inappropriate consequences, and we're not allowed to engage. We're not allowed to go down that path. So we've got to be careful what we expose ourselves to during the day so that it doesn't precipitate some kind of an inappropriate response at another time during the course of the day or during the course of the night. So what he's showing us over here is that's why Hirur, thought, is so much more difficult than action, because action is a lot more black and white. For example, do not steal. Okay, I get it. That means don't take things that are not mine. It's very straightforward. But the thoughts go into all kinds of funny gray areas where you could say, is this a problematic thought? Is it an acceptable thought? Can I get away with this? Should I be thinking this? Should I not be thinking this, right? It's quite a minefield. Or here's another example of where a person's mind can go where it shouldn't go. So up until now, the examples that we used were examples of a person thinking inappropriately. But now we're going to look at a different example, which is, let's say that a person had a perfect opportunity to study Torah. I don't know, what's a perfect opportunity to study Torah? How would you describe a perfect opportunity to study Torah? Besides, of course, a Wednesday evening at the Tanya Shir. But besides that, what would you consider a perfect opportunity to be studying Torah? Now. Why do you say now? Now we're sitting in a Shir now. It's obviously a perfect opportunity.
Because you must jump to do mitzvahs.
Okay, so you're saying now, whenever now might be. But we're going to be a little bit more kind of open-minded with this and say there are certain times that are not suitable for learning Torah. For example, you get some people are morning people and some people are night people. So if you're a morning person, then you're going to hit a certain point of the day where your mind it's hazy. You just can't think. That's not the best time to be learning Torah. So for that person, what's the Shas HaKosher, the best time for them to be learning Torah? In the morning. Other people struggle to get themselves out of bed, but as soon as life starts to settle down in the dark hours, that's when they wake up. That's their time that they should be learning Torah. Somebody's got a spare chunk of time during the course of the day without disturbance. That's a perfect time to learn Torah. Now, just think about this for a second. I was listening to something today where a person was describing, and this is not long ago, they were describing 100 years ago, give or take, 1920. Okay? And they were describing how at that time, and in that community, it was a normal thing. Just think about this for a second. It was a normal thing that when guys went to Shachris in the morning, when they went to shul in the morning, it was going to be 2 hours or more. It was normal. How's that for a thought? Mincha, an hour. Ma'ariv, an hour. For us, if somebody goes over the 15-minute mark at Ma'ariv, everybody starts to get itchy. So in that world, Sha'as HaKosher, to have suitable time to learn Torah, well, they had chunks of time, massive pieces of time, because if you were in agriculture, so you had the season where you had to plow your field and the time that you had to plant your field, and had months and months and months that you waited around for the harvest. If you were the local water carrier, so every morning you drew the water, you did your deliveries, you had hours in the day that were Shas HaKosher. There were times that were available to learn Torah. We don't have that luxury. Not because we have less time, but because we have more distraction. So if you had to pull somebody out from 100 years ago and plop them down in our society, and they saw what we do after hours, they would go crazy. Because for them, after hours was, I don't know, like if it got dark, that was after hours. There was nothing to do after dark. So you either had a good night's sleep, or you sat and learned, or maybe you socialized in whatever limited capacity. We, after hours, our schedule is absolutely full of nonsense. That it's absolutely full. I've got to reply to all my messages. I've got to catch up on all my social media. I've got to watch my series. It's all these things that have cluttered our space. But if we're honest and objective about it, those times are Shas HaKosher. They're appropriate times to be learning Torah. But we're not. I'm not saying all those times. Some of those times we should rather be sleeping. We'd be most productive if we were asleep. I mean, it's never happened in the history of the 21st century that anybody would deprive themselves of sleep for the very unimportant tasks of scrolling through social media or watching a TV series, right? So that's a Shas HaKosher, to sleep, actually, so that tomorrow morning I could be bright and clear, so I could have a Shas HaKosher, an appropriate time to learn. So he says, what happens if it is a Shas HaKosher Lasek B'Torah? That you have time where you really, it's suitable both from a time perspective, from a clarity perspective, from an energy perspective. You should be learning Torah. And instead, the person chooses to spend their time on something wasteful. Wasteful meaning a waste of time. Kiddat number Avos, like the Mishnah tells us in Pirkei Avos, Hanei or balayla chulei, if a person is awake at night, or mefane liboy chulei, and they choose to focus their attention and energy on something which is meaningless, so the Mishnah there is quite harsh and says such a person has taken their life into their own hands, almost as if to say, they don't deserve to live, which is quite hectic, right? So now, imagine proposing to our 21st century audience that every time that you're watching memes on WhatsApp instead of learning Torah, you're a Rasha. People would be mortally offended. Let's not forget that we are living in a society where you could offend anybody in a million different ways. So, hey, here's another way to offend people. Just say, you shouldn't be enjoying that particular TikTok, you should be learning Torah. But factually, objectively, that is true. So, in any of the scenarios that we have described so far in this chapter, all of which are, frankly, the kind of things we wish were our biggest problems. The person who occasionally is distracted from doing what Hashem wants. The person who one part of their life is under the sway of their negative side sometimes. The person whose biggest issue is their fantasies that are never going to translate into behavior. Or the fact that they are watching TV when they should be learning Torah. And that's all Russia. That all fits into the category of Russia. Because the definition of Russia, and this is a fundamental shift that Tanya makes for us, the definition of Russia is not a wicked or evil person. The definition of a Russia is not somebody who has become this rogue criminal. The definition of Russia is somebody who is not following in the now what Hashem wants from them now. That's Russia. Russia doesn't mean bad. Russia means misaligned. So yeah, we'd all very much qualify. Why is that person called Russia? Because at that particular time, through that particular behavior, Shehorashe benafshe goy verboy, the negative side of themselves has gotten the upper hand, and has manifested into the actual space of the human body, and has caused the person to sin, and therefore has brought impurity into that person's life. Okay, so that's just the reality of what a rasha is. Now, last week, somebody asked the question about guilt. And what we're going to see is that guilt plays a very important role in the rasha's life. We're going to get the first insight into that now. And then the subsequent insight is still coming. And we probably won't read it tonight. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. Let's see how we go. This is fascinating information. When we normally, outside of the world of Tanya, when we normally see the word rasha, we think right off. Mess. This person is gone. This person has destroyed themselves spiritually. This person cannot be redeemed. Here says the Alter Rebbe, no. The reality of a rasha is that once they have finished doing what they shouldn't have done, the next phase of their process is the good side speaks up. So after the person has done, thought, or said what they shouldn't have, then then the goodness within the person, which is a function of their neshama, their godly soul, now becomes re-empowered again, and the person experiences regret. So, Jewish guilt, feeling bad about what we have done, that is part of the rasha experience. Okay, so you didn't necessarily see that coming, right? Because everybody thinks that Jewish guilt is a healthy sign of a person who is spiritually aligned. Turns out, no. Jewish guilt is the expression of the disconnect between who I am and what I've done. So let's put that into really simple terms. Have you ever caught somebody in the act of doing something they really should not have done? You ever had that experience? So it could be a parent who catches a child doing something that the child shouldn't have done, or it could be that you bust a criminal in the act. Right? Nobody who gets caught and realizes that they've been caught, because there's also that phase where they don't really realize they've been caught. You know, when there's that phase where they think because they've fooled themselves for this long, they're going to fool everybody else as well. But once they get past that phase, everybody feels guilty. Everybody has regret. And you could be cynical about it and say, well, they're not regretting the fact that they did X and Y. They're regretting the fact that they got caught, which is possibly true. And probably in many cases it's true. Here we're talking about somebody who hasn't been caught. That's not the description of here. He never said that a person did something wrong and then somebody outed them and then they felt bad. No. The person did something wrong. The reason they did it wrong was because they had what in the courts would be called temporary insanity. Temporary insanity means you're not thinking clearly. You're not considering what the consequence of this action is, who you are, how it should affect you. And then after the event, that drive from the negative side that was only activated to get this result doesn't have to be turned on anymore. It got the result, so it switches off. What switches on instead? My neshama, my realization, my truth. And that's why I feel regret. That's why I feel remorse. That's why I feel guilt. So who feels guilt? A rasha. By definition. Because guilt is relative to doing things wrong. Anybody who doesn't do things wrong, why would they feel guilt? Guilt is a rasha emotion. It's a rasha experience. Again, rasha is not a criminal. Rasha is not the evil person. Rasha is a misaligned from God person. So you're misaligned. but you are not disconnected. Therefore, the person does what they shouldn't, but they feel that it was wrong. Okay, so two comments over here to address. The one is a question, doesn't guilt lead to teshuvah? And the other is saying the difference between shame and guilt cultures. So those are two things that we have to explore. Let's talk a moment about guilt leading to teshuvah. Does guilt lead to teshuvah? It's a really, really interesting question. And we've got to just stop for a moment and think about our own experience and about our own emotional wavelength. Does guilt drive teshuvah? I'm open to hear what everybody has to say about it, because I think it's a very interesting question. Okay, so can guilt drive teshuvah? Yes, it can. That is a possibility. It's a possibility. Does guilt drive teshuvah? That's really the question, right? Okay, so somebody's here saying, I don't think so, right? Why not? Why not? See, one of the things that we do when we learn Torah is, if somebody's going to make a suggestion, they have to kind of corroborate that suggestion. Why not? Why would guilt not drive teshuvah? Or for that matter, if you're saying that guilt does drive teshuvah, why would guilt drive teshuvah? And don't respond by saying, well, if you don't have guilt, you'll never do teshuvah, because that might be true, but that doesn't explain if guilt drives teshuvah or not. So now that we've raised this issue, let's just unpack it a little bit, because it's an interesting issue. Because we get we get over our guilt, and then we might do the same thing again. Reminds me of the story. It's a story that's been repeated, I'm sure, by probably every rabbi on the planet at some point. But it's a great story for this particular topic. And that's the fellow who arrives at a bar, and he has a few drinks, and he gets drunk. And once he's drunk, he is unplayable. He gets aggressive with the other patrons of the bar. He starts throwing furniture. He breaks glasses. Eventually, they literally have to escort him out of the bar, and with a stern warning, don't come back, kind of thing. So sure enough, a few weeks later, he's back at the bar, and he gets the stern warning from the bartender: don't behave like you behaved last time. Of course, he has some drinks, gets aggressive, breaks things, smashes glasses, has to be escorted out. When it happens for the third time, the bartender says, that's it, you obviously have a problem. You need to get help, and you're not welcome back in this bar until you get professional help. Okay, they don't see the guy for a year. After a year, he walks into the bar, everybody's on edge, and the bartender says to him, so did you go get help? He says, yes, I went to an amazing therapist, and we've worked through my stuff, and I'm much better than I was. Okay, fantastic. I'll say l'chaim to that. And they give him a drink, and he has another drink and another drink. Before you know it, he's drunk, and he's aggressive, and he's fighting with people and throwing furniture and smashing glasses. And, the bartender's both exasperated and quite annoyed, So he's about to throw him out, and he says, I don't get it. You said you went for help. Where's the help? So I'll tell you. Previously, when this used to happen, I used to feel bad. Now I've come to terms with this. This is me. I don't feel bad anymore. So that's the thing about guilt, yes? Guilt wears off. First time a person does something wrong, they feel terrible about it. Next time, maybe a little bit less. The Gemara says that when a person repeats the same transgression multiple times, it becomes in their mind something that's no longer transgression. No, it's okay. It's good. We're good. I saw my therapist. We're all good. So yes, it is possible that guilt runs out or dissolves, and then eventually the person goes ahead and does what they always did. Okay, next suggestion. If you realize that you have distanced yourself from Hashem, you will do teshuvah. And I agree with that, absolutely. I don't know if that's necessarily the same feeling as guilt. Recognizing that I'm distanced, or that I have distanced myself from Hashem, is not automatically a synonym for guilt. So we'll explore that. Let's just look at the next one. Guilt experiences a disconnect from Hashem, and the drive to reconnect is teshuvah. Okay, so there you go, the same kind of a point. See, the thing is this. Guilt, and this is where I guess you have that fine line between guilt and shame. When a person feels guilty, it is a negative feeling. It doesn't feel nice to feel guilty about something in the same way as it doesn't feel good to be ashamed of something. And generally speaking, positive growth needs to be stimulated by positive feelings. Really difficult to expect that somebody's going to move in a positive way from a negative feeling. Except when that negative feeling is danger. If that's a dangerous place to be, then I'll get a positive response, which is get to safety. But feeling guilty can even become a little bit addictive at times. Oh, I feel so guilty. We all know people like this, right? Oh, I feel so bad. I was going to do whatever, and I didn't get around to it. I feel so bad. And then the next time, I feel so bad. And they become literally addicted to this sense of guilt, because now I feel good about the fact that I feel bad, and then I don't have to do anything further. So even though he doesn't use the word guilt over here, he uses the word mischaret, which means to regret. And to regret what I've done is a good thing, because if I regret what I've done, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an emotion attached to it yet. Guilt is an emotion. Shame is an emotion. Regret is an analysis. That wasn't a good move. The net gain of that particular move was outdone by the net loss. So when you sit down at a year-end analysis, or when a company does a stock take or an audit, they may regret certain decisions that they made as a company because, look, it didn't work. We invested all that money in that marketing campaign and it brought in nothing. So we regret the fact that we did it. Nobody feels guilty about that. Well, they shouldn't if it's a healthy company or a company with a healthy ethos. You don't feel guilty about it. You mischaret, exactly what he says. You regret what you've done. That's what he's describing over here. He's not describing guilt. He's describing an objective sense of, that was a bad move. Shouldn't have done that. Which hopefully will then produce a more positive response the next time. Second point, which is really important, is it's just not good enough to say, I feel so bad. I regret what I've done. If you've done, I mean, these are difficult conversations, right? But if you've dealt with a person, God forbid, who has an addiction, they will have a lot of regret, but not necessarily move because of that regret. So, and the same applies, but that's addiction is maybe an extreme example. But the truth is, the same thing happens in business. I regret that I put my money in that particular investment. And then they'll go and they'll invest in a similar investment again. So regret is not good enough in and of itself. And therefore he continues. Part of the Rasha experience is not just to feel regret, but to ask forgiveness. To actually ask Hashem, okay, I shouldn't have done that. It was a bad move. It's caused spiritual damage. It's interfered with our relationship or whatever it is. So Hashem, please forgive me. Now you can't say please forgive me unless you're actually doing teshuvah. Otherwise, it's a totally vacuous statement. Please forgive me. Earlier this week, somebody asked me about a particular mess up that happened in their kitchen. Somebody mixed the milk and the meat and whatever the case is. So as I was reading, it was a text message. As I was reading the details of the message, I was almost anticipating that the question at the end was going to be, so what kind of flowers do I have to buy? For having messed up the kitchen. Because it's quite empty just to say, oh, I'm sorry, or I regret, or please forgive me. If somebody says, please forgive me, and they don't give you a reason why you should forgive them, then it's a waste of energy. Show me that you're going to do things differently. Show me that you're going to be more sensitive next time, or more present next time, or more available next time, or don't just tell me, please forgive me. It's like, I don't know if you've ever seen this, but in certain yeshivas, before Yom Kippur, so people put signs. So I don't know if it's done in jest or if it's actually real, but put a sign on the yeshiva notice board. Please forgive me if I've done anything to hurt you. It's like the person who sends, maybe you get them. You get these mass WhatsApps wishing you well over the fast. Please forgive me if I did anything wrong. Are you kidding? There's no hallmark, please forgive me. If there's something to forgive you for, then come forward. Tell me about it and let's talk. But empty lip service to saying, please forgive me, is an absolute waste of time. So, this person who feels a sense of regret approaches Hashem, obviously in davening, to ask for forgiveness. V'Hashem yislach loi. And Hashem will forgive the Rasha. Isn't that fascinating? How different is that to certain other theologies? Because there are theologies that say, you only get forgiven if you're saintly. There are theologies that say you're forgiven if you believe in X and Y, then you'll be forgiven. Here, lahavdil, in Judaism, we're saying Hashem will forgive you im shav b'tshuva haru'uya, if the person does teshuvah. So, the Rasha by nature will feel regret. The Rasha by nature will ask Hashem for forgiveness. Hashem is guaranteeing that forgiveness if you actually put in the effort to do teshuvah. And what's teshuvah? And the way to do teshuvah is there are 3 degrees or 3 categories of inappropriate behavior, and there are 3 different categories of teshuvah that a person has to do. It's something which is described in the Gemara in Yuma, which is the Gemara that speaks about Yom Kippur. And here the Alter Rebbe says, as is explained elsewhere in Tanya, he's referring to the 3rd section of Tanya, which is called Igeres HaTeshuvah, an entire section dedicated to the process of teshuvah, which here and in other places clearly was written actually before this section, because he's already referencing the fact that he's discussed it elsewhere. And the order of how the sections was compiled is not necessarily the order how the sections were actually originally written. So here's our first introduction into the concept of guilt. Like I said, we're going to learn a little bit more about it later on in the chapter as well. But the point is that part of the Rasha, the healthy Rasha, is a healthy sense of regretting the bad things, because this person looks in the mirror and says, that wasn't me. I'm upset at myself for letting myself down. This shouldn't have happened. Therefore, I'm going to approach Hashem for forgiveness, not in a superficial lip service way, but actually following the protocols of teshuvah that are set out by our sages in the Gemara. That's how I'm going to approach Hashem. And with all of that, I guarantee you, if we met a person like this, a person like we've just described, we would imagine they were a tzaddik. They barely ever do anything wrong. When they do things wrong, they are really subtle things that they do wrong. They immediately regret having done it, and they embark on a process of rehabilitation through the process of teshuvah. If we meet people like that, that's our hero, spiritually. So we're still going to see 2 more classes of Rasha that we're still going to explore in this chapter. And then we'll get to really where the Alter Rebbe wants to go with all of this, which is to talk about the Beinoni, which is the centerpiece of the whole of the first 53 chapters of Tanya. But we'll still get there. So next week we'll talk about a person who's a little bit more Rasha than this Rasha.